Hi, my name's Ian Kellar. Welcome to session 10 of this systematic review module. Today we're going to be going over the remainder of the PRISMA 2020 items, so PRISMA preferred reporting items in systematic review and meta-analysis, and going over the SWIM items where we're using narrative synthesis rather than meta-analysis. So SWIM stands for synthesis without meta-analysis. So in terms of where we are in the module, we're in session 10, which is writing up and using PRISMA and data synthesis. Each week I've been highlighting to you skills that you should be able to add to your CV after you've completed the action points for each session. After you've completed the action points for this week's session, you will be able to say that you are confident in following PRISMA 2020 reporting guidelines and narratively synthesizing quantitative evidence. So in terms of the action points, you should be finishing the week 9 tasks, which were to finish data extraction of all included studies and record the risk of bias 2.0 and mixed methods appraisal tool 2008 judgments. Now you should remember that last week I got up to item 12, which is to specify for each outcome the effect measures such as risk ratio or mean difference used in synthesis or presentation of results. And I said that this is really for studies that synthesize data using meta-analyses. Now, given we're not going to be using meta-analyses, and instead we're going to use item 2 for SWIM, so the synthesis without meta-analysis guidelines, which I'll describe in more detail later. So, as a reminder, this item states we must describe the standardized metric for each outcome and explain why the metric was chosen, and describe any methods used to transform the intervention effects as reported in the study to the standardized metric, citing any methodological guidance used. That term, standardized metric, refers to the metric that's used to present the intervention effects across the studies for the purpose of synthesis or interpretation or both. And that examples of standardized metrics include measures of intervention effects such as risk ratios or odds ratios. They might also include standardized mean difference, ratio of means, direction of effect, or p-values. Now, typically, we'll be using direction of effect or p-values, but if you want to convert means to standardized mean difference, if you Google Hedges G or look in section 9.2.3.2 in the Cochrane Handbook, it's actually really simple to do. And essentially, assuming that more of the outcome is good, then subtracting the mean of the control group from the mean of the intervention group, and then dividing the result of that by the pooled or total sample standard deviation allows you to express the effect of the intervention as the size of the difference between the two arms in units of standard deviation. It will also let you easily talk about the size of the effect. Now, conventionally, greater than 0.2 is small, greater than 0.5 is medium, and greater than 0.8 is large. However, you might find it's really hard to track down the pooled standard deviation, so I don't require you to do this transformation, as I don't have time in this module to go through all the ways that effects might be reported and all the ways you might transform them to compare effects between studies. So item 13A relates to data synthesis, which essentially means meta-analysis. And the essential item is describe the processes used to decide which studies were eligible for each synthesis. Similarly, item 13B, describe any methods required to prepare the data for presentation or synthesis, such as handling of missing summary statistics or data conversions. The essential item is report any methods required to prepare the data collected from studies for presentation or synthesis. Now, this item is similar to SWIM item 2, which we've already covered, and the extent to which these items differ from SWIM item 2 is irrelevant to us, so you can skip this item. And that's the same for item 13C, which is describe any methods to tabulate or visually display the results of individual studies or syntheses. And I'm not going to describe items 13D, E or F, as these are even more specifically focused on the detail of how quantitative analysis is conducted, which, as I've said, you're not required to do, as the expectation is that you narratively synthesize your results. So item 14 relates to recording bias assessment, and you must Describe any methods used to assess risk of bias due to missing results in a synthesis arising from reporting biases. So the essential items are lengthy. Firstly, specify the methods, tool, graphical, statistical, or other, used to assess risk of bias due to missing results in the synthesis. If risk of bias due to missing results was assessed using an existing tool, specify the methodological components, domains, items of a tool, and the process used to reach judgment of overall risk of bias. If any adaptations to an existing tool to assess risk of bias due to missing results were made, such as omitting or modifying items, specify the adaptations. If a new tool to assess risk of bias due to missing results was developed for use in the review, describe the content of the tool and make it publicly accessible. Report how many reviewers assessed risk of bias due to missing results in a synthesis, whether multiple reviewers worked independently, and any process used to resolve disagreements between assessors. Report any processes used to obtain or confirm relevant information from study investigators. Finally, and this isn't relevant for us, if an automation tool was used to assess risk of bias due to missing results, report how the tool was used, how the tool was trained, and details on the tool's performance and internal validation. Item 15 is certainty assessment. So, describe any methods used to describe certainty or confidence in the body of evidence for an outcome of a review. Now, I would typically do this using GradePro, but I don't teach you this. Review authors typically use some criteria to decide how certain or confident they are in the body of evidence for each important outcome. Factors commonly considered include precision of the effect estimate or sample size, the consistency of findings across studies, any study design limitations identified, and missing results. So in our case, we should describe that we'll use the risk of bias summary table and apply that to inform our uncertainty. We should also specify how directly the studies address the question. So if you've used the MMAT 2018, you can describe your use of that. Now, item 16A, study selection. Describe the results of the search and selection process. So the following items are essential elements. Firstly, report, ideally using a flow diagram, the number of records identified, records excluded before screening, for example, because they were duplicated or deemed ineligible by machine classifiers, number of records screened, and the number of records excluded after screening, titles and abstracts, the reports retrieved for detailed evaluation, potentially eligible reports that were not retrievable, retrieve reports that did not meet inclusion criteria, and the primary reasons for exclusion, such as ineligible study design, ineligible population, and so on, and the number of studies and reports included in the review. If applicable, authors should also report the number of ongoing studies and associated reports identified. If the review is an update of a previous review, report results of the search and selection processes for the current review and specify the number of studies included in the previous review. An additional box could be added to the flow diagram indicating the number of studies included in the previous review. If applicable, indicate in the PRISMA flow diagram how many records were excluded by a human and how many were excluded by automation tools. Item 16B, cite studies that might appear to meet inclusion criteria but were excluded and explain why they were excluded. Item 17, cite each included study and present its characteristics. Essential elements in this item are to cite each included study, present the key characteristics of each study in a table or figure, and in a format that will facilitate the comparison of characteristics across the studies. Additionally, if the review examines the effects of interventions, consider presenting an additional table that summarises the intervention details for each study. Item 18. Present assessments of risk of bias for each included study. The essential elements for this item are present tables or figures indicating for each study the risk of bias in each domain, component or item assessed and the overall study level risk of bias. Present justification for each risk of bias judgment, for example, in the form of relevant quotations from reports of included studies. Now, we looked at this in detail in session 8, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. Item 19. For all outcomes, irrespective of whether statistical synthesis was undertaken. Present for each study summary statistics for each group where appropriate. For dichotomous outcomes, report the number of participants with and without the events for each group, or the number with the event and the total for each group. For continuous outcomes, report the mean, standard deviation, and sample size of each group. For all outcomes, irrespective of whether statistical synthesis was undertaken, present for each study an effect estimate and its precision, such as standard error or 95% confidence intervals. For example, for time to event outcomes, present a hazard ratio and its confidence interval. If study level data are presented visually or reported in text or both, also present a tabular display of the results. There's more detail on this item, but rather than plough through it, I think it's key that when you come to reporting your data, you read this section closely and have it beside you. Section 20 relates to statistical syntheses. So here, again, I defer to SWIM. So, thinking about the synthesis, SWIM item 1A, provide a description and rationale for the groups used in the synthesis. For example, groupings of interventions, population, outcome, or study design. And SWIM item 3, describe and justify the methods used to synthesize the effects for each outcome when it was not possible to undertake a meta-analysis of effect estimates. And SWIM item 5, investigation of heterogeneity in reported effects. So item 5's description is helpful. State the methods used to examine heterogeneity in reported effects when it's not possible to do a meta-analysis of effect estimates and its extensions to investigate heterogeneity. So this could involve ordering tables or structuring figures by hypothesized modifiers such as methodological characteristics, for example study design, or subpopulations, for example sex or age, or intervention components or contextual setting factors, and the justification for the chosen method should be reported. Investigations of heterogeneity should be limited, as they're rarely definitive. This is more likely to be the case when informal methods are used. It should also be noted if the investigation of heterogeneity was not pre-specified, and this will be a limitation for your review because this is the case for us, given we didn't write a protocol. A common approach is to describe the overall effect and then a separate paragraph for each grouping, but describe the effect on the outcome for studies of that grouping, giving the details of the study on the PICO domains. So looking back at data from previous years, among reviews on this module that got over 70%, most synthesized or grouped on intervention. So looking at different types of interventions and comparing what they found. Among reviews that got over 70, most synthesized on intervention, essentially that they grouped on studies where they looked at different types of intervention and looked at the differences in the comparison in the different groups of interventions. Comparator and outcome were also used, and one study synthesized by grouping on each of population, intervention, comparator, and outcome, but where it did that, because obviously there's only 5,000 words, it only talked about effect, so didn't describe the other PICO elements when it was grouping by a PICO element. Whatever you choose to group on, be explicit in your rationale for doing so and the methods that you used. So for example, one review a few years back had the title Adherence to Airway Clearance Techniques Amongst Children and Adolescents with Chronic Lung Disease, with the inclusion criteria, studies which stated airway clearance techniques as being administered by the child themselves or with the support of a parent, caregiver, or physiotherapist were included, as this is important for adherence. When it came to the synthesis, they split the synthesis by intervention type and then compared across groups. Within each group, they described the sample age range and the outcome measures, as well as focusing on details of the intervention content and the duration and intensity of the intervention. Another one of the reviews that got over 70% grouped by comparator. Their title was The Effects of PRISMA Adaptation on the Neuropsychological Test and Functional Outcomes of Patients with Left-Sided Visuospatial Neglect, a systematic review. Their inclusion criteria included studies compared to the effects of PA to a placebo version of this treatment using neutral lenses or an alternative intervention. And they grouped by the comparator content, then compared across comparator groups as well as discussing the overall effect. detail within comparator type groupings focused on intervention intensity, duration, and range of secondary outcomes. So rather than go through the details of a bunch more of previous reviews that got firsts on this module and give you the examples of their use of grouping on the PICO domains, I've put them in some slides in the class materials on the Teams channel. So item 21 of PRISMA is present assessments of risk of bias due to missing results arising from reporting bias for each synthesis assessed. I've not shown you how to assess the potential effect of reporting biases, so you can skip this item. Essentially, it's an issue that can be shown statistically through the distribution of effects and through the inspection of grey literature, so by comparing outcomes and analysis in study registers and protocols and statistical analysis plans with the results that are available in the study reports. But I haven't asked you to do this, so you can skip this item. Certainty of evidence. Present assessments of certainty or confidence in the body of evidence for each outcome assessed. And this is where you're applying what you reported doing in item 14 and 15. So draw on the summary chart if you used Risk of Bias 2.0, or make use of MMAT 2018 if you use that, and draw on that to describe what it tells you about the confidence you can have in the evidence for each outcome. When interpreting the results in the summary of findings or tables or conclusions, certainty might be communicated implicitly using standard phrases, such as, so-and-so might probably reduce the risk of X, Y, and Z. So the items around item 23 are all about the discussion. So item 23A, provide a general interpretation of the results in the context of other evidence. Item 23B, discuss any limitations of the evidence included in the review. Item 23C, discuss any limitations of the review processes used and comment on the potential impact of each limitation. And here you may wish to draw on SWIM item 9, limitations of the synthesis, which says report the limitations of the synthesis methods used and or the groupings used in the synthesis and how these affect the conclusions that can be drawn in relation to the original review question. PRISMA item 23D, discuss the implications of the results for practice and policy and make explicit recommendations for future research. Item 24 relates to registration and protocol, so skip this because I didn't ask you to write a protocol. Item 25 describes sources of financial or non-financial support for the review and the role of funders or sponsors in the review, so this isn't relevant for this module. Item 26 also is irrelevant for this module and is declare any competing interests of review authors. Now, item 27 relates to the availability of data, code, and other materials. So report which of the following are publicly available and where they can be found. Template for data collection forms, data extracted from excluded studies, data used for all analyses, any analytic code used, any other materials used in the reviews. All that should be in the appendices along with the PRISMA 2020 checklist. So I'll put the PRISMA 2020 checklist and the PRISMA 2020 E&E document and the SWIM paper all in the class materials. Please keep these beside you at all times when you're writing up. You will need to refer to them repeatedly. So action points for this week. Finish data extraction of all included studies. Do risk of bias 2 or mixed methods appraisal to 2008 extraction at the same time. Prioritize the tables and figures. This is the last thing you do together. After that, remember, all the rest of the write-up of the review has to be your own work. Now, remember the assessment. It's 5,000 words maximum. Submit an electronic version to the Turnitin software, which you access via Minerva. It's going to be marked by your supervisor and second marked by another supervisor. The assessment will be based on the use of reporting guidelines as described in this module. Tables and figures do not contribute to the word count and should be included in appendices. Put a placeholder in line where the tables or figures would have been. You are not required to submit a paper copy. This module must be passed for your degree. The hand-in is the 7th of the 1st next year, and the hand-back is the 28th of the 1st. Okay, that's all I've got. Next week is the last week of term. Hopefully I will get around to finishing the slides I've done on automation in systematic reviews with a focus on screening and in particular on use of Rayan. But otherwise, that's all I've got for these series. So thank you so much for your engagement and enthusiasm. You're very welcome to say hi on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Otherwise, that's all I've got. Thanks. Bye.